Hey everyone, so now I'm going to be talking about domain and range. Um, Basic definitions for these. The domain is the x values of any function, and then the range is the y values. So we're just going to be talking about, well, we'll go through some examples of different ways that we can find domain and range. Let's just start it off. So the first example is a table. Let's see. So if you remember from the last video, we've been talking about that, or we talked about how this table kind of represents a bunch of different coordinate points. So like I could write this as -5, -5, -4, -4, 0, -1, 3, -1, and 7, 1. Um, but the table makes it really easy because it already split up all of the x values and y values for you. So it's really easy for me to find my domain and range. My domain is literally just going down that first row. When we write the domain, we like to write it from least to greatest, just to make it pretty. And then the range is that second column, so it's the y values. So we've got -5, -4. Now notice you have two -1s here. When you write the range, you only have to put one -1 because you're just saying that -1 is a part of the range. You don't have to tell me how many times it's a part of it, just that it's a part of it. So there we have it, the domain and range. Okay, let's go through another example. And this example is with coordinate pairs. So let me write them all out. All right, so we can set it up in a table if we want to, but really what we're doing is we're going to say the domains are the x values. So if I just go down this row, my x values are 5, 6, 2, -3, and -1. And if I want to make it pretty, I'm just going to put it in order from least to greatest. That would be negative. Let me see if my pen will work. -3, -1, 2, 5, and 6. So there's my domain. And then the range, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to go down my list, but now instead of picking out my x values, which were the first, I'm going to pick my y values, which are the second in the coordinate point. So I've got 6, 8, -5, 1, and 0. And once again, I'm going to put them in order from least to greatest. -5, 0, 1, 6, and 8. And there is my range. Not so bad, right? All right, so these next two examples get a little bit harder. So it's a graph. Let's see if I can be semi-specific. Okay, so here's our graph, and we want to find the domain and range. When you have a solid line like this, instead of listing out a list of numbers, you have to write it in an interval or an inequality. And so there's two different forms that we're going to use. We're going to use interval notation and then inequality notation. I'm going to write all of my answers down both ways. So I'm going to start with inequality notation. And we're going to start with the domain. Remember, the domain is the x values. So when we're doing this with a solid line, we want to say, well, for the domain, what's the leftmost x, and then what's the rightmost x. So in this case, because of these arrows right here, the graph would just go on forever and ever and ever to the left, which means my leftmost x is -infinity. Oh, sorry, I wrote it in the wrong form. Let me try it again. So my leftmost x is -infinity. Now I'm going to say is less than x, and then that's less than or equal to my rightmost x. And now my rightmost x, if you can see, is right here. That's at 4. So this is my inequality notation for domain. Because of this negative infinity right here, I could actually just write it that x has to be less than or equal to 4, which just means that 4 is the highest point that it can get to. It can go as low as it wants to, but it can only get to 4. Then for my range for inequality, range, remember, is y values. So instead of looking at the leftmost x to the rightmost x, we're going to look at the very bottom y to the very top y. Once again, because of these arrows, even though they're pointing to the left, they're still kind of going down and still kind of going up. So they're just going to go on forever and ever. They're going to go lower and lower and lower and higher and higher and higher, which means that your range in this case is actually all real numbers, because they're just going to continue to get higher and lower as they go. So when you see arrows, you want to assume infinities or all real numbers. The other way you can write this is like from negative infinity is less than y is less than infinity, but both ways suffice. Now let's talk about interval range or interval notation. So interval notation uses brackets and parentheses. I'm going to write it up here. Brackets are when a number is included, and parentheses are when it's not included. So a couple of different rules on this. Infinities are never included. Infinities will always have parentheses around them. If there's an open hole or an open dot in your graph, that's also a parenthesis. If there's a closed dot, that's considered a bracket. And we can mix and match here. So we can put a bracket on one side and a parenthesis on another. I'm going to show you how now. So the domain, if we look at this kind of the inequality version of our domain right here, it's from negative infinity to x, then 4. So when you write this, what you're going to do is you're going to say parenthesis negative infinity, comma, 4. And then it's a bracket. So what this tells me is that it's going to go all the way from negative infinity, and it's going to come up and up and up and up. And then when it hits 4, it has to stop. Now 4 is included in that because there was no open hole at 4. Let me talk about that. So if you look back at the graph, it kind of curves around at 4. If there was some open dot right there, then that would be considered not included, because what that tells me on a graph is that it gets really, really, really close to 4, but it doesn't hit it if there's an open dot. Because there's no open dot right there, what that tells me is that it is included. So those open dots are the things that you're looking for when you're trying to find parentheses. So these two domains say the same thing, they just say it in a different way. Now let's do the range in interval notation, and we know that it's from negative infinity to positive infinity or all real numbers. So the way that I'm going to write it is negative infinity, comma, positive infinity. Both of them have parentheses around them because whenever we have infinities, that's not included. The reason why infinities aren't included is because there's no such number as infinity, so you can't include something that goes on forever. Okay, let's go through one last example, and this is another graphing one. It looks super similar. Let me try and get as specific as I can. Okay. All right, so once again, this has the arrows, which tells me that you're going to have some infinities. Anytime you see arrows, you're kind of planning on infinities. So we're once again going to do this in interval notation and inequality notation. But let's start with our interval notation first. So the domain on our interval notation is from the leftmost x to the rightmost x. Because of these arrows, what this tells me is that it's going to continue to go left and continue to go right. Like if my graph was really big, it would just continue and continue and continue. until it reached the edge of the graph, and then we'd have to make the graph bigger. So what that tells me is that it has to be all real numbers, or from negative infinity to positive infinity. Okay, now my range, instead of your x values, you're talking about your y values now. So when you talk about range, you're going to go from the lowest y to the highest y. So the lowest y in this case is right here, and that's at -5. So I'm going to put a -5 right here, and because there was no open dot right there, I'm going to put a bracket around it. Then the highest y, because of the arrows, it's going to continue to go up and up and up and up, which means that your highest y is infinity. And once again, we put brackets around, or I'm sorry, parentheses around infinities. So those are my two domains and range in interval notation. Now we're going to do inequality notation. And inequality notation domain, because the domain is from negative infinity to positive infinity, we can just say all real numbers. The other way we can write it is negative infinity is less than x is less than infinity. And then your range, we know that the lowest y is -5 and then the highest is infinity. So the way we can write that is -5 is less than or equal to y is less than infinity. Or because of that infinity, you can just kind of get rid of the infinity on here and say just -5 is less than or equal to y. Or if you want y in the front, we can write y is greater than or equal to -5. All of those options work for sure. Anyway, there we have it, domain and range.